I've always preferred the night shift. There's a certain peace that comes with it, a break from the chaotic noise of the daytime. You get paid to drink terrible coffee, stock a few shelves, and mostly just exist in the quiet. But after what happened to me 3 years ago, I can't even walk into a convenience store after dark without my chest tightening. At the time, I was working at a completely independent, run-down gas station situated right on the edge of a forgotten stretch of state highway in northern Minnesota. There was nothing around for at least 20 miles in any direction, just dense, towering pine trees that felt like they were leaning in to swallow the place whole. The station itself was a relic. Flickering, harsh fluorescent lights, cheap linoleum floors that were impossible to keep clean, and a radio behind the counter that usually only picked up a local AM station through thick layers of static. It was mid-January, and the local news had been warning us all week about a massive blizzard moving down from Canada. When I clocked in for my graveyard shift at 10 p.m., the snow was already coming down hard. My manager, the heavyset guy named Rick, practically sprinted out the door the second I walked in. "Lock the doors if it gets too bad," he had said, zipping up his heavy parka. "Nobody's going to be out in this anyway." By midnight, the storm had upgraded from a heavy snowfall to a blinding, violent whiteout. The wind howled against the thin glass of the storefront, rattling the heavy metal window frames. It sounded like something massive was out there, trying to claw its way inside. The temperature dropped so fast that the edges of the glass began to frost over, turning the massive front windows into opaque, icy walls. I poured myself a cup of the station's notoriously awful, burnt-smelling coffee just to have something warm to hold. Around 12:30 a.m., the familiar chime of the front door echoed through the empty store. It was my last customer of the night, an older guy in a beat-up Chevy Silverado who lived a few towns over. He stomped his heavy boots on the mat, leaving wet, dark puddles on the faded linoleum. He bought 2 packs of Marlboros and a black coffee. He looked exhausted, his face red and raw from the biting cold. "You're in for a long one, kid," he muttered as I handed him his change. "Roads are already knee-deep. State patrols are shutting down the interstate. Nobody's getting in or out of this county until the plows come through tomorrow." I watched him walk out, his wind instantly whipping his heavy coat around. His truck engine roared to life, and within seconds, his red taillights were completely swallowed by the churning white wall of snow. After that, the silence of the store felt heavy, oppressive. The only sounds were the low, vibrating hum of the refrigerated drink coolers and the steady, rhythmic buzz of a dying fluorescent tube directly above my head. I pulled out my cell phone to text my roommate, but the screen only showed 2 words in the top corner: "No service." I sighed. The storm must have knocked out the nearest cell tower. A prickle of unease started to crawl up the back of my neck. I wasn't used to being completely cut off. To soothe my nerves, I reached for the dusty, yellowed landline phone sitting on the counter by the register, just to make sure I still had a lifeline to the outside world. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver and pressed it against my ear. There was no dial tone, just a hollow, empty hiss of dead air. I clicked the receiver hook a few times. Nothing. The lines were down. I was completely, utterly alone, trapped in a glowing glass box in the middle of a frozen wasteland. I slowly set the phone back on its cradle, the plastic making a sharp clack in the quiet store. I took a deep breath, telling myself I just needed to ride it out until sunrise. But then, slicing through the howling wind outside, the motion sensor chime from the gas pumps rang out.
Ding, ding.
I froze. Through the frosted, icy glass of the front window, I saw the blurred, yellowish headlights of a vehicle slowly pulling into the pitch-black lot. I stood frozen behind the counter, my hand still hovering near the dead landline phone. The motion sensor chime from the pumps was a harsh, synthetic sound that usually meant nothing more than another sleepy driver needing a fill-up. Tonight, it sounded like an alarm. Through the thick, creeping frost on the massive front windows, the twin beams of headlights looked distorted, like 2 glowing, predatory eyes trying to pierce the whiteout. The vehicle crawled forward at a painstakingly slow pace. It was a dark, boxy shape, maybe an older model van or a large, battered SUV. though the heavy, chaotic curtain of falling snow made it impossible to discern the make or model. It crept past the first row of pumps, its tires crunching faintly against the thick layer of snow that was already burying the concrete island. I expected it to stop at the pump closest to the front doors, where the overhead canopy lights cast the brightest glare. Instead, the vehicle rolled all the way to the very edge of the lot, parking sideways at pump 8. It was the pump furthest from the store, sitting right on the perimeter where the faint, sickly glow of the station surrendered to the absolute pitch-black void of the tree line. The engine died with a rough, sputtering cough. The headlights remained on for a moment, illuminating a furious swirl of snowflakes in front of the rusted grille. I waited. I kept my eyes locked on the dark silhouette behind the windshield, expecting the driver's side door to pop open. I figured they'd hop out, shivering, quickly swipe their credit card at the pump or make a mad dash for the front doors to use the restroom and grab something warm. But nobody got out. 5 minutes ticked by. I know it was exactly 5 minutes because my eyes kept darting back and forth between the rusted vehicle and the glowing red digits of the digital clock on the cash register. 12:43 a.m., 12:48 a.m. Then the headlights out by pump 8 flicked off with a sudden click, plunging the vehicle into total darkness. Now it was just a massive, heavy shadow sitting at the edge of the lot, barely visible through the raging blizzard. "Come on, man," I whispered to myself, the sound of my own voice feeling fragile in the suffocating quiet of the store. "Just pump your gas and go." 10 minutes passed, then 15. The rhythmic buzz click of the failing fluorescent tube above me felt like a metronome counting down to something terrible. I started to rationalize the situation, desperate to calm the rapid thudding against my ribs. "They're probably just waiting out the storm," I told myself. "The roads are totally impassable. They realized it was too dangerous to keep driving and decided to sleep it off in the parking lot." It made sense. It was the logical conclusion. But a primal, instinctual part of my brain, the part that kept my ancestors alive in the dark, was screaming at me. Every hair on my arm stood on end. I felt intensely, overwhelmingly exposed standing behind that brightly lit counter. The convenience store was a glowing glass box in a sea of blackness. Whoever was out there in that freezing van could see my every move, while they remained completely hidden in the shadows. At 1:07 a.m., I finally decided to step away from the register. I crouched down slightly, intending to slip into the small back office to watch the black and white security monitor instead of standing out in the open like a target. Just as my hand touched the swinging waist-high door of the counter, I heard the heavy, metallic creak of a car door opening. The sound carried sharply over the howling wind. I snapped my head back toward the front window. A tall, jagged shadow had separated itself from the dark mass of the vehicle. I held my breath, watching the figure step into the pale yellow light of the overhead canopy. They didn't reach for the gas pump. They didn't even glance at it. Instead, the figure turned and began walking slowly, deliberately through the knee-deep snow, heading straight for the glass front doors of the store. I watched the jagged silhouette grow larger as it trudged through the unbroken snow. The figure moved with a strange, unnatural stiffness, their shoulders hunched high against the biting wind. The violent swirling of the blizzard obscured their features until they stepped up onto the concrete walkway just outside the glass. For a terrifying second, the person just stood there on the other side of the frosted door, a dark, looming mass peering through the melting ice. Then, a heavy, gloved hand grabbed the metal handle and yanked it violently open. The electronic chime, ding-dong, was instantly drowned out by a shrieking howl of wind that swept into the store. A blast of sub-zero air hit me like a physical punch, carrying with it a flurry of loose snow that scattered across the faded linoleum. The man stepped inside. The heavy glass door swung shut behind him, cutting off the roar of the storm and plunging the store back into that suffocating, heavy silence. He was massive, standing at least 6'3", wrapped in a filthy, oversized army surplus parka that looked like it hadn't been washed in a decade. A frayed, dark gray beanie was pulled down low over his brow, shadowing his face. The lower half of his jaw was covered by a thick, matted beard, glistening with frozen condensation and melted snow. He smelled distinctly of stale sweat, wet wool, and copper, like old pennies left out in the rain. He didn't shake the snow off his coat. He didn't stomp his boots to clear the slush. He just stood perfectly still on the entrance mat, letting the melting ice drip in dark, dirty puddles around his heavy, steel-toed boots. "Crazy weather out there, huh?" I called out. I forced my voice to sound casual, practically straining to hide the tremor in my chest. "Need some coffee? Just made a fresh pot." He didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge that I had spoken. The man slowly turned his head toward the counter. From beneath the rim of his ratty beanie, I caught a glimpse of his eyes. They were wide, unnervingly wide, and completely devoid of the exhaustion you'd expect from someone stranded in a blizzard. They looked feverish, frantic. Without a single word, he turned away from the register and began walking down the first aisle. Squelch, squelch, squelch. The wet, heavy sound of his boots on the linoleum echoed through the quiet store. I stayed glued to my spot behind the counter, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I listened to his footsteps. He wasn't walking with the hurried, shivering pace of a freezing man desperate for warmth. He was strolling, prowling. Our store had 3 long aisles of snacks and automotive supplies, ending near the refrigerated drink coolers in the back. The shelves were high enough that I couldn't see over them. The only way to monitor the blind spots was through the large, convex security mirror mounted high in the back corner of the ceiling. I kept my eyes locked on that warped, dome-shaped mirror, tracking his distorted reflection. He reached the middle of aisle 2, the chips and candy section, and stopped dead in his tracks. I waited for him to grab a bag of jerky or a candy bar. I waited for the familiar rustle of plastic wrappers, but there was only silence. The faint, persistent buzz of the overhead fluorescent lights felt deafening. I leaned slightly to the left over the cash register to get a better angle on the mirror, and when I did, the breath completely left my lungs. He wasn't looking at the merchandise. He had his back pressed against the shelving, his head tilted upward. In the distorted reflection of the security mirror, I could see his face for the first time. He was staring directly into the glass, making dead, unblinking eye contact with my reflection. And as he stared, his lips curled into a slow, wide, humorless smile. I stared back at that warped reflection in the security mirror, my stomach dropping as a cold, heavy weight settled in my gut. That smile wasn't a polite, passing greeting. It was predatory. It was the look of someone who was enjoying a twisted game, someone who knew exactly how isolated and trapped I was in this glowing glass box. My mouth suddenly felt like it was stuffed with dry cotton. I swallowed hard, desperate to find my voice and break the suffocating silence. "Sir?" I called out, my voice betraying me by cracking on the single syllable. "If you're not going to buy anything, I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside or in your vehicle. Store policy." It was a pathetic bluff. We had no such policy, especially not in the middle of a deadly whiteout, but I needed to establish some kind of boundary. I needed him to know I wasn't just going to stand there and be his prey. The wide, humorless smile slowly faded from his reflection. He didn't blink. He just held eye contact through the curved dome mirror for another excruciating 10 seconds before he finally tore his gaze away. Squelch, squelch, squelch. His heavy boots resumed their slow, deliberate pacing, but he didn't head for the exit. He rounded the end of the aisle, passing the glass doors of the refrigerated section. The main compressor kicked on with a loud, sudden shudder, making me jump almost out of my skin. But the man didn't even flinch. He just kept walking, tracing the back perimeter of the store. As he walked, he dragged his thick, gloved fingertips along the edge of the shelving. I watched in disbelief as he casually knocked a few bags of trail mix and a box of automotive fuses onto the floor. He didn't bother picking them up. He was making a mess deliberately, just to see what I would do. I didn't move an inch. I kept my right hand resting casually beneath the register counter, my fingers wrapping around the cold, knurled metal of the heavy Maglite flashlight we kept tucked on the bottom shelf. It was the closest thing I had to a weapon, a pathetic defense against a man his size, but just holding it stopped my hands from shaking. Outside, the wind violently battered the building, shaking the large front windows so hard they audibly rattled in their cheap aluminum frames. It was a constant, deafening roar out there, contrasting terribly with the tense, heavy quiet inside the store. He finally emerged from the third aisle, stepping into the open space near the front door. I tensed, my grip tightening on the heavy flashlight until my knuckles turned white. But he didn't lunge at me. Instead, he stopped about 10 feet away from the counter, right in the center of the main aisle. He stood perfectly still next to a spinning display rack of cheap sunglasses, his head tilted slightly to the side, just studying me. His breathing was heavy and ragged, his chest rising and falling beneath that filthy parka. The smell of him, that awful metallic mixture of damp decay, old sweat and wet copper, wafted over the counter, making my throat tighten. "Look, man," I tried again, gripping the edge of the counter with my free hand. "The storm is bad, I get it, but you can't just stand around knocking things over. You need to buy something or leave." He took one slow step forward. The wet, heavy thud of his boot against the linoleum sounded like a gunshot. He reached up with a thick, grimy hand and slowly peeled the wet beanie off his head, revealing greasy, thinning hair plastered to his pale skull. He shoved the hat deep into his coat. Then he finally opened his mouth. His voice was completely at odds with his massive, imposing frame. It was a high, thin, reedy whisper that somehow cut straight through the humming of the coolers and the walling of the wind outside. "You're all alone in here," he whispered, staring dead into my eyes. His whispered words, "You're all alone in here," hung in the stale air, suffocating and heavy. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, a frantic bird-like flutter that made it hard to draw a full breath. The heavy Maglite flashlight in my hand felt slick with cold sweat. "No, I'm not," I fired back. My voice shook terribly, but I forced the lie through my teeth. "My manager is right in the back office. He's doing inventory. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling him out here." The man didn't blink. He just stared at me with those wide, feverish eyes. Then his chapped lips parted, and a low, rattling wheeze escaped his throat. It took me a second to realize he was laughing. "Rick?" he whispered, his high, reedy voice echoing off the cheap linoleum. "Rick went home at 10 o'clock. He drives the dark blue Ford, the one with the rusted bumper." A wave of absolute ice washed over my entire body, rooting my boots to the floor. All the blood drained from my face. Rick had left at 10. He did drive a beat-up blue Ford. That meant this man hadn't just gotten stranded by the sudden blizzard. He had been out there in the freezing darkness watching the store, watching me, for over 3 hours. He took another slow, heavy step toward the counter. "It's very cold in the trees," he muttered, almost to himself, his head twitching slightly to the left. "Too cold for waiting, too quiet. But you have warm blood in there, don't you? It must be nice and warm behind that counter. Does your mother worry when you don't call her back? Mine didn't." The things he was saying made no sense, but the predatory intent behind them was undeniable. He was unraveling, shedding whatever thin veneer of a stranded motorist he had walked in with. He took another slow, heavy step toward the counter. He was now only an arm's length from the plexiglass lottery ticket display. Slowly, deliberately, he plunged his right hand deep into the oversized pocket of his filthy army surplus parka. I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to move. Directly behind the register was a heavy, reinforced steel door that led into the small security and manager's office. It was a leftover feature from when the station used to cash paychecks in the late 90s. I abandoned the register, lunging backward. I grabbed the cold metal handle of the security door, shoved it open, and threw myself inside. I slammed the heavy door shut and threw the thick deadbolt lock with a loud, echoing clack. I backed up against the manager's desk in the cramped dark, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. I raised the heavy Maglite flashlight like a club, my eyes locked on the small, scratched, reinforced window set into the steel door at eye level. I expected him to vault over the counter. I expected him to start pounding on the glass, screaming, trying to tear his way inside. Instead, he just stood there. Through the scratched window, I watched as he slowly pulled his hand out of his pocket. He wasn't holding a gun or a knife. He was holding a thick, coiled length of dirty yellow nylon rope. He let it drop from his fingers, uncoiling it onto the countertop with a sickening heavy slap. Then, above my head, the flickering fluorescent lights gave a loud, angry pop. The constant hum of the refrigerator coolers died instantly. The store plunged into a dim, sickly gray twilight, illuminated only by a pair of weak emergency backup lights and the pale, ghostly glow of the blizzard filtering in from outside. The power was out. The heating system hissed and fell silent. But as terrifying as the sudden darkness was, it wasn't the worst part. As my eyes adjusted to the sudden gloom, I looked past the man standing at the counter, staring out through the massive frosted front windows, and my breath completely caught in my throat. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across the store, turning the aisles into dark, cavernous trenches. But my eyes weren't on the shadowed corners, and they weren't on the massive, filthy man standing just inches away on the other side of my reinforced door. They were locked on the thick, frosted glass of the front windows. With the bright overhead canopy lights dead, the blizzard outside had become a swirling sea of slate-gray shapes. But there, standing near the concrete island of Pump 8, was a silhouette. It wasn't the dark, boxy shape of the van I had been watching earlier. This was a person. They were standing completely motionless in the middle of the raging whiteout. In weather that severe, a normal person would be fighting to stay upright, burying their face in their coat collar to avoid the stinging, blinding ice. But this figure stood with an unnatural, terrifying rigidity, their arms hanging loosely at their sides. They didn't flinch, didn't shiver. They were just standing there, facing the store, staring directly through the snow at the spot behind the counter where I was now locked away. My mind violently struggled to process it. I had been so hyper-focused on the dark van, and then so utterly terrified by the man who had walked inside, that I hadn't even considered he might not be alone. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach, knocking the wind out of me. The first man, the one now standing on the other side of the steel door with a coil of thick yellow nylon rope, wasn't just a disturbed drifter looking for a warm place to sleep. They had planned this. They had waited for Rick to leave, waited for the storm to isolate me, and now they were springing whatever sick trap they had laid. "He doesn't feel the cold." The reedy, whispering voice drifted through the scratched plexiglass window of my door. I flinched, my attention snapping back to the giant in the oversized parka. He had turned his head slightly, following my terrified gaze out the front windows. His face was bathed in the sickly amber glow of the emergency exit sign. That horrible wide smile had returned, stretching across his matted beard, exposing yellowed teeth. "He's been out there a long time," the man continued, his breath fogging the other side of my window. "He likes to watch, but he's getting impatient now." The temperature inside the store was already plummeting rapidly. Without the low hum of the heaters or the coolers, the silence was absolute, save for the muffled, endless shrieking of the wind battering the roof. I could see my own breath pluming in the dark office. The security monitors on the desk next to me had gone completely black. The dusty landline phone was still a dead piece of plastic. I gripped the heavy Maglite flashlight so hard my hand ached, backing up until my shoulder blades hit the freezing cinderblock wall of the back room. "What do you want?" I choked out. My voice sounded weak, pathetic. I hated how terrified I sounded, but I couldn't stop my entire body from shaking. "Take the money. The register is open. Just take it and leave." He didn't look at the register. He didn't even glance at the cigarette racks or the lottery tickets. Instead, he reached out with one thick, grimy finger and slowly traced the frame of the reinforced window on the steel door. "Money won't keep us warm," he whispered. Then he turned his back to me and began walking slowly toward the front of the store. I watched through the scratched glass, a sickening wave of pure dread washing over me. He walked straight past the aisles, ignoring the merchandise entirely, stopping only when he reached the heavy glass entrance doors. He reached out, grabbed the metal lock mechanism on the inside of the handle, and with a loud, sharp click, he flipped the deadbolt open. He pushed the glass door wide open, letting a vicious howl of wind blast into the store, and stepped aside. He was letting the other one inside. The heavy glass door banged violently against the doorframe, held open by the massive man in the filthy parka. A miniature blizzard immediately roared into the front of the store, sending a flurry of snow and discarded receipt paper swirling down the aisles. The sudden drop in temperature inside my cramped, steel-reinforced office was instantaneous, biting through my thin uniform shirt. I clutched the heavy Maglite flashlight, my knuckles white, staring through the scratched plexiglass window of my door. I watched the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. The figure from the pump island stepped out of the blinding whiteout and into the pale, sickly amber light of the emergency exit sign. It was a woman, or at least I think it was. She was completely swathed in dark, wet layers, a heavy, oversized canvas coat that hung almost to her knees, thick rubber boots, and a dark knit ski mask pulled down over her entire face, leaving only 2 ragged holes for her eyes. She moved with an agonizing, jerky slowness, as if her joints were partially frozen or she was fighting against some unseen weight. She stepped onto the entrance mat, the snow instantly melting into dark puddles around her boots. The man in the parka released the door, letting it slam shut against the wind, cutting off the shrieking roar of the storm. The heavy silence slammed back down on the store, broken only by the wet shh of the woman's rubber boots dragging across the linoleum. "She's so cold," the giant whispered, his reedy voice carrying easily through the quiet store. He didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on my fortified door. "She needs to get warm." The woman didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge him. She just began walking, her head tilted at a stiff, unnatural angle, her gaze locked dead ahead. But she wasn't walking toward the aisles, or the coolers, or the register. She was walking directly toward the reinforced door where I was hiding. Panic, raw and suffocating, clawed at my chest. I backed away from the door, my shoulder blades pressing hard against the freezing cinderblock wall of the office. The reinforced steel and the deadbolt suddenly felt terrifyingly flimsy. Shh, shh, shh. The sound of her dragging boots grew louder. I could see her silhouette filling the scratched window. She stopped inches from the glass. For a horrifying moment, all I could see were those dark, ragged holes in her ski mask, staring blindly into the dim office. Her breath fogged the plexiglass, a slow, rhythmic puff of white vapor. Then she raised a hand. It was encased in a thick, wet leather work glove. She didn't knock. She didn't try the handle. She simply placed her gloved palm flat against the center of the scratched window and began to push. It wasn't a violent slam. It was a slow, sustained application of pressure. I watched in frozen horror as the heavy steel door actually groaned against the doorframe, the thick deadbolt straining under the silent, relentless force she was applying. "She wants to come in," the man's high, whispering voice floated from somewhere near the first aisle. He had moved out of my line of sight, vanishing into the deep shadows cast by the emergency lights. She needs a place to sit. Why won't you let her sit down? The metal frame of the door creaked loudly. The screws holding the deadbolt casing onto the cinderclock wall gave a sharp metallic ping. I raised the heavy maglite flashlight above my head, my hands shaking violently. If that deadbolt gave way, I had exactly one swing before they were on top of me. "Get back!" I screamed, my voice cracking, echoing shrilly in the tiny room. The woman didn't react. She didn't flinch. She just kept pushing. The heavy leather glove pressed flat against the glass, her dark, empty eyes staring straight through me. Then, from the dark depths of the third aisle, a new sound cut through the silence. It wasn't the man's reedy whisper. It was the loud metallic shuck-shuck of a pump-action shotgun chambering around. The metallic shuck-shuck of a shotgun chambering around shattered whatever fragile delusion I had left that I was getting out of this without a fight. The heavy maglite in my trembling hand, which had given me a pathetic sense of security just seconds ago, suddenly felt about as useless as a rolled-up newspaper. Through the scratched plexiglass, the woman in the ski mask immediately stopped pushing. She slowly lowered her leather-clad hand, leaving a smeared, greasy imprint of melted snow on the outside of my window. Without a word, she took one stiff step backward, retreating into the dim, sickly amber shadows cast by the emergency exit signs. From the pitch-black mouth of the third aisle, the giant in the filthy parka emerged. The weak light caught the dull, scratched steel of the barrel first. It was an old, long-barreled pump-action shotgun, the wooden stock splintered and hastily held together with thick strips of dirty silver duct tape. He held it casually, the muzzle pointed at the cheap linoleum floor, but his wide, feverish eyes were locked entirely on my face through the small window. "Wood expands when it gets cold," he whispered. His high, reedy voice didn't need to be loud. In the dead, powerless silence of the store, it carried perfectly over the muffled roaring of the blizzard outside. But metal shrinks. It gets brittle. It snaps. He took a slow, heavy step forward. Squelch. My brain finally snapped out of its frozen paralysis. If he fired a slug of buckshot into that reinforced glass, or worse, directly into the deadbolt mechanism, the door was going to give. I spun around in the cramped, freezing office, my flashlight beam cutting erratically through the dark. I needed a barricade. I needed something, anything, to put between me and that steel door. Against the far cinder-block wall sat Rick's massive four-drawer metal filing cabinet. It was crammed full of years of receipts and payroll documents. It had to weigh at least 200 pounds. I shoved the maglite under my armpit, grabbed the sharp metal edges of the cabinet, and pulled with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength my body could muster. The metal base screamed against the concrete floor, a harsh, ear-piercing screech that briefly drowned out the howling wind. I hauled it backward, the muscles tearing in my shoulders, my boots slipping on the dusty floor, until the heavy steel cabinet slammed hard against the back of the reinforced door. It wedged perfectly under the handle, an immovable hunk of solid metal bracing the lock. I collapsed against the side of the cabinet, gasping for air, my lungs burning from the rapidly dropping temperature in the room. I snatched the flashlight back into my hand, aiming its blinding white beam directly at the scratched window. The man was standing right on the other side now. The harsh beam of my maglite illuminated his face in terrifying high-definition detail. The glistening wetness of his matted beard, the raw, wind-chapped skin around his nose, and those horribly wide, unblinking eyes staring at the filing cabinet I had just wedged against the door. "You're making her wait," he scolded softly, leaning his face so close to the glass that his hot breath immediately fogged over the woman's greasy handprint. "She really doesn't like waiting." Slowly, agonizingly, he raised the barrel of the shotgun. He didn't point it at the heavy deadbolt. He didn't point it at the steel frame. He pressed the cold, hollow steel muzzle directly at the center of the scratched plexiglass window, aiming dead at my face. "Open the door," he whispered, his thick, grimy finger curling tight around the trigger. The cold steel circle of the shotgun barrel rested dead center on the scratched plexiglass, perfectly aligned with my forehead. Time didn't slow down like they say it does in the movies. It just stopped completely. For a fraction of a second, the only sound in the universe was the frantic, sickening thud of my own heartbeat. Then, his thick fingers squeezed the trigger. Instinct, raw and unthinking, threw me sideways. I dove hard toward the floor just as a deafening, thunderous roar ripped through the tiny office. The sound was absolute agony, a concussive wave of pressure that boxed my ears and sent a high-pitched, endless ringing shrieking through my skull. The reinforced plexiglass didn't just break, it exploded. A violent shower of jagged plastic shrapnel and heavy lead buckshot blasted over my head, tearing into the cinder block wall behind me and raining down onto the linoleum like hail. The heavy steel door shuddered violently against its hinges, but the 200-pound filing cabinet I had wedged beneath the handle held firm. The heavy metal screeched in protest, sliding maybe half an inch backward, but the barricade held. I hit the ground hard, my shoulder taking the brunt of the impact, the maglite skittering a few feet away into the dark. Acrid, choking smoke poured through the newly blown hole in the door, carrying the harsh chemical stench of burnt sulfur and gunpowder. And with the smoke came the cold, a direct, freezing draft from the main store that cut right to the bone. "It's loud." The giant's reedy whisper floated through the jagged hole, completely devoid of the adrenaline or panic I was drowning in. "She doesn't like loud noises." I scrambled on my hands and knees, my ears bleeding sound, frantically sweeping the dark floor until my fingers brushed the cold metal of the flashlight. I snatched it up, clicking the beam back on, and pressed myself into the tight corner beside the doorframe, keeping my back flat against the freezing cinder block so I was out of his direct line of sight. Through the intense ringing in my ears, I heard the terrifying shuck-shuck of the pump action sliding again, chambering another shell. But he didn't fire. Instead, the beam of my dropped flashlight, which was aimed at a sharp angle toward the ceiling, caught movement at the jagged hole in the door. A thick, wet leather work glove reached through the shattered window. It was the woman. She wasn't trying to unlock the deadbolt. The filing cabinet was blocking it from opening anyway. She was just blindly reaching her hand into the dark office, her thick fingers grasping at the empty air, twisting and flexing with an awful, jerky desperation. The frayed edges of her oversized canvas sleeve caught on the sharp plastic shrapnel still lodged in the frame, but she didn't seem to care or even notice. "Give her your hand," the giant whispered from somewhere just out of view. "She just wants to hold it." Panic completely took over. I couldn't let them dismantle my barricade. I couldn't let them get inside. My eyes darted around the tiny, cramped office, landing on the heavy red fire extinguisher mounted to the wall just above Rick's desk. I lunged upward, tearing the heavy metal cylinder from its bracket. The leather glove was still writhing blindly through the shattered window, her fingers snapping at the dark. I raised the heavy steel base of the fire extinguisher over my head, my teeth bared in a silent, terrified scream, and brought it down with every ounce of strength I had, directly onto her wrist. There was a sickening, wet crack that echoed loudly in the cramped room. For the first time all night, one of them made a sound that wasn't a whisper. The woman let out a wet, guttural shriek, a sound so raw and animalistic it made my blood run instantly cold. The leather glove jerked back violently, disappearing through the jagged hole, taking a chunk of her canvas sleeve with it. "Now look what you've done," the giant's voice hissed through the gap. The playful, reedy tone was entirely gone, replaced by something deep, guttural, and undeniably furious. "Now you've made us angry." I scrambled backward, clutching the heavy red fire extinguisher to my chest like a shield. The giant roared, a guttural, animalistic sound that vibrated the cinder block walls, and the heavy steel barrel of the shotgun smashed through the remaining jagged teeth of the plexiglass. He didn't fire. He used it like a battering ram, violently bashing the reinforced steel door. The metal shrieked. The massive filing cabinet groaned against the linoleum, sliding another agonizing inch backward. I pulled the metal pin on the extinguisher, aiming the black rubber hose directly at the jagged hole. If that door gave way, I was going to blind him with dry chemical foam and start swinging the steel cylinder until one of us was dead. "Open the door," he bellowed, throwing his massive shoulder against the steel. The hinges screamed. The smell of copper, wet wool, and burnt gunpowder was suffocating. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the final splintering crash. But the crash never came. Instead, a new sound cut through the deafening roar of the blizzard and the giant's furious pounding. It was a low, mechanical rumbling, a deep, heavy vibration that actually shook the frozen ground beneath the gas station. Then, a brilliant, sweeping flash of strobe light, vivid, blazing amber, sliced through the frosted front windows, illuminating the dark aisles in rhythmic, rotating bursts. A massive county snowplow. The pounding on my door stopped instantly. Through the shattered window, I heard the heavy, wet squelch of the giant's boots rapidly backing away. I held my breath, my frozen finger still trembling on the extinguisher trigger. The heavy glass of the front entrance slammed shut. Outside, barely audible over the idling roar of the plow, the coughing sputter of a cold engine choked to life. Tires spun wildly, screaming against the ice, before the dark van tore out of the lot, disappearing into the blinding whiteout just as the plow lumbered toward the pumps. I didn't move the filing cabinet for 3 hours. Not when the confused plow driver banged on the front glass, and not even when 2 state troopers finally arrived just after dawn, their radios crackling in the quiet, freezing store. They had to practically shout through the shattered window of the office to convince me it was safe. When I finally dragged the barricade away and pushed the warped steel door open, the store was eerily silent. The cops found the massive coil of yellow nylon rope sitting neatly on the checkout counter. Beside it, knocked over from the hardware display, were a pair of heavy-duty box cutters and a roll of industrial duct tape. The security cameras had cut out when the power failed, but the tire tracks out by Pump 8 showed the van had been parked there since 9 p.m. They had watched Rick leave. They had watched me for hours. The woman's blood was smeared across the jagged plexiglass of my door, but despite a massive county-wide search once the roads cleared, the police never found the battered van, the giant in the filthy parka, or the woman in the ski mask. I quit before my shift officially ended. I handed Rick my keys as soon as he walked in, and I never went back. It's been 3 years, but the cold paranoia hasn't faded. Every time the temperature drops and the snow starts to fall, I make sure every deadbolt in my house is thrown, because I know that out there, somewhere in the freezing dark, there are people who don't feel the cold, people who are just waiting for the storm to trap you all alone.